So, it's been real easy for me. I've been on the downhill slope. I make all kinds of mistakes, okay? And I can buy a property for $200 million. I can sell it 10 years later for $300 million and say, wasn't I smart? Maybe I should have only bought it for $180 million instead of $200 million. So you're in for a tough row here. You're not going to have the ease that I had as I've been in the industry. But that means there's also opportunities. So again, learn all this Wall Street stuff. Sounds like a pain in the neck and it's complicated, and it is. But learn and study that game, because if you're going to be successful as a real estate investor or developer in this country, you've got to understand the money flows, and you've got to be able to talk their language. And you've got to understand the 28-year-old Wharton MBA is going to ask you how high the curves are. And you can't roll your eyes and say you're an idiot. You got to say they're 12 inches, sir. Anybody know how high a curve is?
About 8.
Now I know. 42 years, and now I know how high a curve is. Okay? Why that analyst wanted to know that is beyond me. Okay? Learn that game. Learn what drives. Bankers will drive you nuts. Absolutely drive you nuts. Why do banks make things so complicated? Why does it take so long? Why do they have so many forms? Anybody know? It is really, really hard to do a development deal or a commercial deal with a bank right now. They're not coming up with this stuff. The examiners are, the regulators are. So rather than rolling your eyes and getting mad at your banker for taking so long, understand who's driving his behavior. It's those regulators. And maybe put yourself in his shoes and say, you know, I'd probably be doing the same thing that you're doing, given that those regulators, what can I know about regulation? How can I speed things up? How can I help you with this pain that you're going through? Okay, it's absolutely critical that you understand all the things that are influencing the real estate market today on the capital side. No longer local. International money is driving real estate. We're in a low interest rate environment that's going to change ultimately. And right now we've got way too high prices to make sense. Enough said. Any questions?
Knowing that we've operated in a low interest market before, in your experience, how do you think you can capitalize on a situation like that?
In a low interest rate environment? Well, I'll give you a couple of things. You can get, for apartments, you can get construction and permanent financing through HUD. Real cheap. Today, 3.23%. And it's 30 years, none of this 10-year stuff. Okay? It's a pain. You got to go through all kinds of regulatory nonsense, and they limit how often you can take money out and everything else. But what I would do is try to, first and foremost, I want to get away from that 10-year, 7-year call. That scares me to death. I can't predict the future, know what's going to happen. Fix the rates right now as low as you can. Do a full amortization, 25, 30 years as much as you can, which probably means HUD, or maybe a life company. Life companies are making fully amortizing loans right now. Lock in the rates. It's a great low interest rate environment. Lock in the rates. And then the other thing I would do is don't go where everybody else is going. Okay? We own a portfolio of properties in Indianapolis. I mean, it's an interesting city, but you know, it's going to go up at 2 or 3% every single year. Good years or bad years, it's just kind of going on. The buildings are 20 years old. Wall Street guy comes in and says, don't stop, speed up, I don't even want to look at them. Okay? When you buy a building, a multifamily building, a permanent building, what are you buying? Income stream. Who cares about the bricks and sticks? You'll keep them under repair. Yeah, it costs more to maintain a 20-year-old building than a new building. Okay? If one of those Indianapolis properties is producing $100,000 a month of cash flow, and nobody wants to look at it from Wall Street, and there's one in Atlanta producing 100,000 a month in cash flow, and everybody's looking at it, you're gonna make money in Indianapolis. You're not gonna make money in Atlanta. So we're big believers in doing what nobody else is doing, and trying to go after those niche markets. The other thing is, whatever you decide, if you're gonna be involved in development, know your product and know your customer, okay? We have an opportunity right now in a joint venture to build a apartment complex in downtown Austin. The customer would be young tech guys, Amazon, Dell, all those people. They all want to live downtown, all right? Now, what do we know about this customer? You know about a 26, 28-year-old techie.
They like phones.
Probably.
They like phones.
They what?
They like phones.
Didn't hear you.
They like smartphones.
They like smartphones, okay? Are they married?
No.
Probably not. Do they work long hours?
Yes.
Okay.
What you mean?
Do they spend a lot of time in their apartment?
Yes.
Okay. Depends on whether they're working from home or whether they're going somewhere to work. What else do you know about them? How much money do they make? Actually, they don't.
50,000.
Okay. Where do they make their money?
Stock options.
Stock options. Okay. So they're doing okay. I'm not crying poor mouth, okay? But they can afford a decent rent. They're not making $100,000 a year being in salary being a techie. What else do you know about them?
They like to party.
They have roommates.
Probably.
They never left college. Okay? And what we've figured out is a 2-bedroom unit in downtown Austin, going to these techies, there will be at least 4 people, and sometimes they convert the living room into a bedroom and make that and bring in 5 people. Okay? What do you think the turnover rate would be in an apartment complex like that?
Why?
Why?
You get a lot of movement.
Okay. I'm cashing in on my stock options. Am I staying there?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we finally figured out, and it dawned on us one day, this is student housing for post-college graduates. This is not suburban, multifamily, anything else. And what we know about student housing, 0. And so we figured out we need a student housing team manager that really specializes in that and say, okay, the student housing, but it's for the 26, 28-year-olds. So my point is, you really got to know your product and you got to know your customer. You got to be experts at that. You can't just say, I'm gonna go buy ground and I'm gonna build something. You got to, we have a group in Virginia that develops retail. They've been doing it for 30, 40 years. They know everything there is to know about retail. They're talking to Walmart every month. They're talking to all the big retailers. That's what they do. If I went to that group and said, let's talk about self-storage, they'd like, I'm talking Russian. I don't know. I don't do self-storage. Know what you know. Okay? I'm trying to be a broad developer of all things. Other questions?
Is that student house the place where you have showers coming out the ceiling?
I told you that story. Let me tell you what he's talking about. We built a very, very nice suburban, Charlotte suburban apartment building. Okay, and I went to visit it just before opening, and all the showers are the ceiling showers. Okay, nothing, not the shower head coming out of the wall, all ceiling showers. All right. How do you feel about that?
Good for guys, not good for girls.
How do the women in the class feel about an overhead shower? No way. Okay. Guess who designed this complex? So I'm looking at this with 2 daughters and a wife, and I said, Mark, our development manager, Mark, what's going on? People love overhead showers. He said. I said, your guy friends love overhead showers, right? What do you mean? He said, women, you know the whole deal. wash your hair every day and blah, 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 blah. And like the blood drains from his face, right? And he says, well, if we put in the both with a valve, those valves leak. Okay? So get rid of the ceilings and put in the wall. Well, we can't do that now. We hear from prospective tenants that issue more than any other issue we hear. It's not about pricing. You just watch it, you watch the couple go through, and the woman will, and they're beautiful. I mean, upgrade, granite, and everything else. They walk in that bathroom, they're going, I don't like that. Okay? You got to really know your customer. Okay? Other questions, comments? Yes?
You touched on retail and how, there's a lack of rent being paid on time. But in South Florida, I see so many new retail structures going up. Who's supporting that market? Is it, just, overseas investors? Because half the retail shops I see in these strip malls are open and relatively new. So.
I've never built a strip center that wasn't at least 75% pre-leased. And I walk into the lender, and we usually have local lenders and stuff like that. I got a deal on Federal Highway at Oakland Park. I'm gonna build a 60,000 square foot strip center, and I'm 75% pre-leased, and the lender says, wonderful. I've never once opened one of those centers and gotten 75% of my rent. Okay? The lender doesn't care. You do enough to, and what are they asking? They're only putting up a 75% loan as long as they can sell it for 75%, plus they know we're going to pay the bill anyway. Okay? Now, I don't want to say this is consistent throughout the world, but those little strip centers with, I'm not talking about national tenants. AT&T's going to pay, all the big tenants are going to pay. I'm talking about the local mom and pop. The Walmart stores are majority owned by women. Usually it's a homemaker who became an empty nester and decided to open up a Walmart store. Probably wouldn't be your first choice to run a business. On the other hand, their enthusiasm and commitment is incredible. Okay, but what drove that decision from a money standpoint? Lender just said, you're 75% pre-leased on good. This has been a new phenomenon, though, for us. I'd say up until about 6 years ago, we were okay. But now they realize they can get in there. They get a really big allowance from the owner, the tenant improvement allowance. And then it's kind of like the mortgage deal. They stop paying the rent. What are you going to do, kick them out? Not unless you got another tenant. And they know they can get away with it. You drive up and down Federal Highway, you're right. It's amazing how many strip centers there are, right? And they all look like they're full, and they are. They're not paying the rent. So. Did I answer your question?
I see, I live in Dade. There's every other block on this King Boulevard, there's a new center going up. So I don't know how they're getting all this funding with all these vacancy rates, or, do you think it's funnel money?
Could be. A lot of friends and family money. The other thing is, on a strip center, it all comes down to what you pay for the land. You can't save your way out of a bad land decision. You have a ton of CVS and Walgreens down in Dade, like we do here in Bud. Yeah. Now there's an interesting demographic. Okay, it's getting older people. People are getting older, more and more prescriptions. It's interesting to see how those chains are. They're kind of like the old SNL model, right? I got to be on every corner. Okay, I don't want them to drive 5 miles away. I don't know that I can actually answer your question thoroughly about the smaller centers down here in South Florida. I do know a lender will, if you're 75% pre-lease, the lender will more often than not give you the loan. Where they're getting the equity from, I'll bet it's a lot of small developers, friends and family type of money, something like that.
This is just a theory on that, but I think a lot of that development is driven by our internet bubble, which I would call it, because there's still a ton of money going into retail. However, it's no longer foot traffic. So they're building these places because they're still making a lot of money. But at some point, that blows up once people they realize that people are no longer walking into these buildings.
Guys at Best Buy told us that 50% of the people that come into Best Buy don't buy in the store. It's really a display store. And so they realized, they were behind. They realized, wow, that's, all right, we're gonna fully stock this thing and show everybody the product, but when they finally do buy online, we want them to buy from us. And they really beefed up their online site very, very quickly. It's a pretty good site now. But you also, if you're sitting there looking at a $2,000 TV while you're in Best Buy, and you seem to be interested, and they really teach your salespeople how to figure out your interest, pretty soon they're giving you a coupon to a discount or something to get you to come back to their site. Yeah.
Price match too.
Sorry?
Price match with Amazon.
Oh, the price match, absolutely. That's the other thing they told us. Price match is very, very important. Nobody ever uses it. Yeah.
They used to give you a hard time about it, because I'd go in there on their computer and pull up the competitors, and I'd take the computer on their computer and show it to them, like, well, we're not really sure about that, and
You know, we said we'd only match the price if it was on a Saturday night between midnight and 3 a.m. Had to be on page 7. Yeah, they figured out that they had a lot of controversy inside their chain about doing price match. Finally, they said, let's try it. They were surprised, and all it did was it captured sales, and nobody ever called them on it. I'd say nobody, very few. Other questions?
So, from your experience and how the economy is right now, you think we're heading into another recession?
I think there's going to be incredible pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low. We all know they're going to go up. I've been saying that for 5 years. You know, Alan Greenspan's famous quote was when anybody would ask him, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and anybody would ask him what's going to happen to interest rates, his answer was they're going to change. That's all he would say. They've got to go up. You saw it, you can't be at 0 or close to 0 in these interest rates. So it's not if, it's when. But there's nothing that hurts an economy worse than raising the interest rates. But we're in new territory. We've never been in this low an interest rate environment before. My own opinion is an increase in interest rates would return some rationality to this business. I think banks are having a really difficult time making money. You don't want your lender struggling. You want your lender to be profitable and be able to grow, be flexible, and give you the loans that you need. They're in a tough environment right now. So I'd like to see the interest rates. I don't want to see them get up to 10% again, but I'd like to see them return to some more normal level. But the key is going to be not if, but when, and how quickly. And I think there's just going to be a lot of political pressure on the Federal Reserve. Okay, but do it very, very slow. And let's do a quarter point. Let it last for 6 months, and we'll, as opposed to a shock. Did I answer your question?
That will decrease the pressure on the economy if they do it slowly, I guess, right? I mean, if they raise interest.
And you can imagine, you know, geez, we finally got unemployment down to 5.5%, and now you're raising interest rates. You're going to suck money out of the economy. Who's the biggest borrower in the world?
we are.
Okay? So we increase interest rates, what happens? Our interest costs go up, right? That's another big pressure. As long as we're in this deficit spending, by the way, I got absolutely no clue how to stop it, but we've got to stop it. We have left your generation a huge, huge mess. Just incredible what we've done with you guys, with all the debt that we're leaving you in the entitlement program. So I'm not playing politics left or right. Somebody's got to solve this problem, or else interest rates. We're going to remember when Nixon said don't raise rates because they got to get reelected, and they artificially kept rates low, and then when they finally released them, what happened? There was a big spike. That's what's going to happen here. Ultimately, there's going to be enough pressure where the Israeli investors are going to say, you guys are not getting your house in order. I'm going to go invest in China, Australia, Germany, and all of a sudden the money flow is going to stop and the rates are going to go up anyway. So I think it's gotta happen, I hope it happens, and I hope it happens slower than faster.
Also, I mean, the slower it happens, isn't that gonna keep, you know, values of property artificially higher and higher, ever higher until equilibrium?
The Federal Reserve, not that they would, if the Federal Reserve came out and said we're increasing rates by 1% right now, I think you'd have a crash.
Yeah.
I don't know the numbers, but I think we have a crash. So they're smart. They're not going to do anything that crazy. So politicians put pressure on us, it doesn't matter. So, other questions? Yes.
You said it's a matter of when, not if. When do you think it will happen?
Boy, if I knew that, I would not be waking up at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. 16 times in my career, I bought interest rate hedges from banks to try to lock in rates, and all 16 times I bet wrong. All 16 times. If I bet interest rates are going up or bought protection against them going up, they went down. So I'm the worst guy you could ask for when it's going to happen. No clue.
Well, whatever you tell them, we'll just take the opposite.
There you go.
16 for 16.
Well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate your time. Good luck with it. Now you're going to hear the real word from the guy that really knows what's going on. When are interest rates going up, Tony?
I knew that. All right, 5-minute break. Okay, you ready to stretch?
Thanks, good to see you.
A lot, we covered a lot of good stuff in a short period of time.
Short haircut?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure.
Beautiful. Here we go.
Where you work?
Right now, I'm a contractor.
Oh, good.
Terry South is a good stuff.
The best. Yeah.
Can I use this?
Yep. You got a.
Wait, you have one? Okay.
You've got a.
So it's both,
Does it have a? Is this
yeah.
Yeah, we just put that in here.
right.
So,
Some value.
Might take a second for it to get recognized.
minus your 885. Stock working now.
I've done pretty well.
So you
Yeah.
There to see if it'll,
Yeah, just use that as our after school stuff. You use 7 trillion or 6.3?
Okay, there we go. Now
Yeah,
it's,
definitely.
okay, it's good to go now.
Yeah,
Or
I'd
should
love
be.
to. I'd love to get together with you. Why don't we, I mean, you get out and about, or?
So
Yeah.
you take your
Ever do a,
one for
your breakfast?
Sure.
Yeah, I live down here at the fort, 17th Street. So maybe if we want to get together one morning, we can like bus or something, or something, whatever.
That's good, that's
You have a calendar?
These control these lights?
Yeah, so that first switch, I think, is the one that
Oh, I see.
So you got everybody to get here on time.
So then,
Like bright and early.
if
I felt like I was late.
the purchase price is 100 million stocks worth.
But you record every clip. Right.
All
Like,
What do you do with it?
We post it all to YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
and then the only way we reference it, so there's, we just put the name of the course title, we don't put any names on there, so if somebody does a search, they're not gonna find it unless they go SU, MSRED.
Is 8 too early?
But, yeah, no, it's worked out really well, because it's a great way to get folks who are here, they're not here on time, or if they
The property itself has that opportunity.
Any person, when you find yourself saying something, probably shouldn't be.
You know, that works. Let's do 90.
You know, you make those blanket statements, like, well,
Yeah.
lenders can be really evil and, you know.
Where is your thinking of what the school's thinking, or your thinking, but doing more classes online?
I mean, we're probably doing the software courses, you know, doing those online, but the ones, normal lectures or classes.
The difference between privatized and
You know where else you'll find her?
Not one of those, at least.
Right, I'm gonna do it to be determined for location.
I think one of the beauties of us doing the recording of these is that it's important to have
Yeah,
something
here, let's see.
to check out, because all I'm posting is raw footage, so.
Okay.
I've seen
Email
stuff. I mean, actually, advertisements, and somehow.
Yeah, well, in Georgetown, yeah.
But
there is.
total degree, without ever going on in this subject. Really, you gotta do something, you know?
There's an information premium value. I mean, properties that are really
Very, very true.
I think that's what they say. Cap rates down. Sure. But
Yeah, I need to change my route. Take 6 or 8. Some comes out, so.
The software class for us. Online. PhD is back here
Writing software.
I don't write the software.
Oh, you know?
Yeah.
Oh,
Argus.
you
This is the Argus developer and Argus at DCF.
Oh, okay.
Courses that I've been teaching so far. So.
So you teach Argus?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I still can't get past doing a formula for
Excel.
Excel. I just don't have any, it just, you know, where I am in life. It doesn't-
Yeah.
I don't have enough things to practice on, you know?
Yeah.
There was a time in my life,
Bill.
I wish I had it, I was with the world.
Yeah.
And I go back to accounting spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Right, no, you don't read spreadsheets.
Yeah, well, what Argus developer and Argus DCF are basically Excel spreadsheets.
I got it.
Right.
All right, good. All right, we'll see you then. Nice to see you again.
You too. I have one question for you.
Sure.
The last time you were here, you talked about that dam breaking for this little town.
No.
You never, because the insurance said they weren't, or is that the company?
Guess the others goes there this morning.
Well, we entered into an agreement with the city that they got some funding. The city repaired all the improvements. A couple of people have heard personally.
Oh, wow.
It was a pain.
Good seeing you. Yes. We've always been having it.
Everybody.
Where's the snacks on it?
Huh?
Where's the snacks on? Shut up. The water that drinks too?
Okay, let's go ahead and get started here in a couple minutes.
Wait, is there anything you want me to stand for?
No, just anywhere, the water, I mean, is that inherently mission critical that it takes up, you know, even
You wanna give me a call?
physical presence as much as it is just words. I mean, it pretty much covered. Okay.
No, I did it quite a while and just want to do something else. So 954-899-1401.
Yeah.
Give me a call anytime.
Good seeing you again. I know you.
Thanks.
You hanging around, Jesse?
I'm not. I got to do something with my wife, so
Oh, okay.
good luck.
I thought you were gonna have lunch with her.
I was, but I can't. straighten them out and correct everything I've said wrong, right?
No, you laid a nice foundation for me.
But thanks so much for having me. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, our second speaker this morning, Tony Trella. Tony is also a member of our advisory board. He has been extremely active in the Urban Land Institute, has a background, it encompasses predominantly single-family residential development, and so I've asked him to sort of come in and give his perspective on that industry and kind of a historical context, and then also kind of insights about the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony Trella.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
What was just described by me is true, although I've done a lot of residential development, I've done a lot of residential land development, but I've also done a lot of commercial development and other things. So I spent the first half of my career running rather large development companies. At one time I was president of one of the largest development companies in the world. And in 1993, for a lot of reasons I won't bore you with, I just stopped and I quit. And I went from 1,000 employees to me. And I had no plan. And ultimately, because I knew so many people in the industry throughout the country, my phone started ringing and people started asking me, well, what are you doing now? I said, really nothing. I didn't realize how burnt out I was after running some very big companies for a number of years. And so they, well, why don't you come out here and help me run my company, take a look at my project. And I said, all of a sudden I said to my wife, guess what? I said, I'm a consultant. And so I've spent the last 15, 20 years consulting the industry, both on the financial capital market side and also the development and building side. Okay, here's what we're going to do this morning. I'm going to give you a history course. Okay, I'm going to give you a history of residential housing in America. And why are we going to do that? Because I'm a firm believer in the fact that if you don't know where things came from, you're never ever going to figure out where they're going. Because you've heard the old adage that if you don't pay attention to history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I'm telling you here, starting off before we talk about anything, is that residential housing in the United States and in most parts of the world will never, ever, ever be what it was. And you people, young, with long lives ahead of you and great careers ahead of you, have to, the quicker you learn that, the quicker you hopefully will avoid stepping into the shoes of your predecessors and thinking that whatever they did successfully has to work again. The days of looking in the rearview mirror, how to find the future is over. So we're going to start with some history of this. And I'm not here to challenge how well you know history and how well you did in history or anything like that. Although as an older person with grandchildren and so forth, I am disappointed about the limited amount of history that the average young American is taught today. The basis of our conversation is going to be World War II, which took place in the world between 1939 and 1945, for those of you who don't know. And it's okay that you don't know, because I guess you've all seen those interviews on the streets when they go up to people and say, you know, what countries fought in World War II? And they'll say the most ridiculous things because people just don't know. So World War II, United States, if we look at America prior to that, from the colonial days up to 1945, 1946, America was a land of rental housing. It was more common to rent than to own. In fact, somewhere in the mid-30s, in the middle of the deepest depression, about 65% of Americans rented. World War II came along, and the following events came out of World War II. So as you see, we're going to start in circa 1946. 13 million Americans, mostly males, but some females, went off to war, and when war was over, 13 million people came back and said, I'm back, I want a life, I just made all these sacrifices, we won the war, what are you going to do for me? There was no housing for them, there was no educational plans for them or anything, so America, standing in this victorious position of having won the war, found itself in 1946 and 1947 with the most incredible social problems that anybody could have ever perceived. At that time, the population in the United States was about 135 million people. 165 million later will be added between the end of the war and 2010. So in the period after the war till a few years ago, we way more than doubled the population of the United States. We added 165 million people during that period. So obviously, those 165 million people had to live somewhere and so forth. So housing was in a crisis, millions were living in inadequate housing. The government was actually building Quonset huts. These are long tubular houses that were made out of tin and steel, and there were millions of people living in these temporary housing, going to temporary schools, and so it was kind of chaotic. So one of the first things the government did is they passed the GI Bill of Rights, which I hope you've heard of. There's still segments of this around. And what it allowed back then was it guaranteed every single military person who served in the war a free college education, or in a lot of people, high school education and college education. So all of a sudden, if you wanted to go to college, you went to college for free. And then we also needed then the start of mass production of housing, because the pressure, the demand for it was so incredible. A man came along by the name of William Levitt. Bill Levitt, for those who you might have heard his name. He made a major breakthrough in thinking. Now, was he a genius? Was he a visionary? He probably was. He was probably all of that, but he was also a very smart business guy and a very successful real estate developer. So he builds and he goes out into the suburbs of New York City and the suburbs of Philadelphia, and he buys farms. In fact, on Long Island was all potato fields and so forth. And he organizes and he designs this, and there's a picture, an aerial picture of Levittown around that time. And these were some small little houses, 2 or 3 bedrooms, 1 bath, single family garage, on a very large lot, quarter-acre land, and which gave the house the ability to grow. And this was the basis, accidentally, of planned communities. Because before that, we really never concentrated on planning housing, production, and design, and so forth. So this was a rudimental first shot at a planned community, not even knowing what to call it back then. They called it subdivisions back then. Along also came along, well, here's a picture of what the Levittown might have symbolized. We're going to come back to that. Another thing that came along in the early 50s, into the 50s, and then through the 60s and into the 70s, was the creation of the interstate highway system, which is all the roads with an I in front of them. Now you have to understand that prior to that, if you can imagine an America with no interstate highway system, that US 1 federal highway was the only way you can get from Miami to New York. You had to drive on federal highway. So the war taught us that we needed more ground transportation. And we knew that we're going to have more and more people coming to live in America. So I'll tell you a little side story, a little bit of side history. The president at that time was Eisenhower. Eisenhower proposed to Congress that we build this interstate highway system, and at that point, Congress was in a mood not to spend any money because we spent tens of billions of dollars on the war, and they said, you know, we have to pay our debts and we can't have the money for this. But Eisenhower and his administration had this great vision of saying, if we don't build these highway systems, we're never going to get America off the ground. I mean, we need these roads and so forth, because we had converted all of the General Motors and the Ford plants and everything from making cars to making tanks and airplanes and everything we did in World War II. So now it was time we had to go back and we had to make cars again. Well, wait a minute. All these 13 million people and the other 20 million people coming, all going to have cars. What roads are they going to ride on? So real quick, the president comes up with the idea of, we need this highway system in case of another war, because we're going to have to be able to move our tanks and everything around a lot faster than we did in the last war. So Congress passed the system, and that was the basis of how we started our interstate highway system. But you have to understand, once we started building these roads, we opened up the country to development. Because without those roads, how are we going to get to all these developments we're going to build? So the American dream takes roots. An affordable home in the suburbs with a large backyard, safe streets for children, clean air, new schools, landscaping, privacy, and a high degree of self-esteem and a sense of accomplishment. It was now an accomplishment to own a home. How you doing in life? I got a house. I got a car. I drive to work. And this picture, I don't know where I ever found it, really symbolized maybe like 1955, what the American dream was visualized as. A mommy, a daddy, 2 kids, car in the driveway, a nice single family house, and we were off to the races. We had the plan of what a housing was going to be in the future. So we have all these people now, by the way, coming home, and they're all getting married, and we're making a lot of babies in the late 40s and early 50s. And of course, they eventually became what you people have heard or are known as the baby boomers. So between 1945 and 1962, more people were born in the United States in history until you guys came along. Because there are more millennials today than there are baby boomers, but baby boomers is a huge, huge chunk of demographics. So, we got this great metamorphosis taking place in America. We got planned communities and we've got residential housing, and we're off to the races. Soon everybody started saying, we need more Levittowns. Levittown's not enough. So all of a sudden in California, in Texas, in New Jersey, in New York, all over the United States, developers started copying Levittown, started planning big subdivisions, started building, well, let me go back to Bill Levitt's house for a moment. Bill Levitt's house was like a cookie cutter. Looking back, economists look at Levittown and say that was the creation of the home building factory. The only difference about this factory, it had no roof, but it was like a production line. And we still do that today. You know, they pour 10 foundations, and then they move on and they put 10 foundations, and over here the next guy, they start framing the house, and they walk down the street. It's an assembly line. It just doesn't have a building and a roof on it. Well, people realized that if we're going to have to build a lot of houses, we need this assembly line mentality. But the thing was, he also had like a Henry Ford philosophy. Henry Ford, when he was making the Model T and created mass production for cars, they said, Mr. Ford, every car we're doing is the same color. We got to give people color. And he said at the time, I'll give them any color they want as long as it's black. Because why? Because that was efficient, it was easy. So there was a lot of that in the early home building. We'll give them anything they want as long as it's 2 bedrooms, as long as it's 1.5 bath, as long as it's this refrigerator, as long as this cabinet. That's the only way this is going to work. So everybody started copying that. So by the 60s, Levitt is like, this is the biggest developer in the United States at the time. People who worked for companies, for Levitt, and I had thousands of employees, they started getting itchy and said, hey, I can go out and do this myself. So all of a sudden, Levitt became the incubator for the industry's next leaders. And you would have found, if you were alive and in the real estate industry in the 60s and 70s, almost everywhere you went in the industry, regardless of the product, somebody there was from Levitt. So they kind of became like a foundation of management philosophy, and management style. And places like, you might not have heard of these places, Reston, Virginia, Irvine Ranch in California, Mission Viejo in California, Columbia in Maryland, are gigantic communities, and they are today. Bill Rouse was the creator of Reston. He was considered a visionary, terrific guy. And so what we got going on here is the first obvious inclusion of live, work, recreate, or play. You know, you've all heard the term, we want to do everything in one place where we can live, work, and play. This was the foundation of this going on. But what we were also doing is we were really beefing up segregated zoning. So what does that mean? Well, the theory back then was you can't have a house next to a shopping center. And you can't have a shopping center next to an industrial plant. And you can't have this next to a hotel. You have to put this over here, and this over here, and this over here. And so for 30 or 40 years in America, we built everything separated. If you went to a suburban planned community, you had to drive 5 miles to go get a container of milk because you weren't allowed to put a store there. Or, you know, the office had to be a half-hour commute for the people living in there. So this became very, very embedded in American planning thinking. Now also while this was going on, a man named Charles Frazier in North Carolina and South Carolina in the late 60s, mid-60s, late 60s, he said, why do we have to limit planned communities just to housing? Why don't we really, why does it have to be just for primary housing? Why can't we create secondary housing and bring a lot of recreation along with it? So what did he design? He designed a place called Hilton Head. And what Hilton Head was, golf courses, marinas, a whole bunch of things. So all of a sudden, planned communities now took another road, and like it was like a spider web growing. Another version of planned communities included golfing, boating, and a whole bunch of things. And oh, by the way, at this time also, it was introduced, multifamily housing was introduced in these communities. So by 1970, an American dream, particularly in the Sun Belt, which is all of the states in the southern part of the United States, was alive and well in the new suburbs. But while that was taking place, the cities started really decaying in America. In the 1970s and 1980s, the cities were a disaster in the United States. I mean, New York City went broke, literally. It had to be bailed out by the federal government. I mean, because why? Because everybody left for the suburbs. Everybody went to work in the city, got off the commuter train or out of their car, went into an office building, worked for 8 hours, got back in the car and went back out to the suburbs. And the cities in America, for all intents and purposes, were like dark, gloomy, criminal, crime-infested places at night. But no one seemed to care because everybody wanted the American dream. So, I'm sorry. So we saw an explosion of all these different things in master plan communities. But the 1960 model was no longer viable. Now we started adding golf courses, gates, walls, extensive landscaping, variety of housing types, sizes, parks, lakes, green belts, monument entranceway, homeowners associations. Planned communities started really getting complicated. But it was just an extension and an explosion of an elaboration of the American dream. So the American dream of the 60s was not good enough for the people in the 70s, and the paradigm for the 70s was not good enough for the people in the 80s. So we kept enhancing, shopping centers were added, extensive retail, schools, and so forth. But if you remember, not remember, but if you look at them, all of the commercial was out front on the highway, and back here were all the houses. So if you lived in a place like Weston, I mean, hopefully a lot of you know Weston. You can drive into Weston's 10,000 acres, it was built by friends of mine at Arvida, and there's 18,000 houses in Weston. But if you live all the way in the back of Weston towards the Everglades, and you want to go and get a container of milk, you have to drive about 3 or 4 miles through the community to get there. Because all of Weston's commercial and retail and everything is out on I-75. So people had to get in their cars to go anywhere. So we improved the quality of life of Americans with the American dream, but the whole model had things wrong with it. Let's see, where are we here? Okay. So in the 80s, we saw more of this happening. There was very little, if any, visionary expansion. We just kept doing the same thing. But then we started to be at war with ourselves. Now people were starting we started hugging trees. We started saying, wait a minute. What are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing to the environment? What's going on here? So all of a sudden, by the 80s and early 90s, we have all these growth, no growth issues, transportation problems, education. What about clean air and what about clean water? Something seemed wrong, but there were neither clear definitions or guiding leadership. The few developments who had the vision and remedies were now stifled by government and political paralysis. So the model of the 70s and the 80s was no longer adequate, but most did not understand why at the time. They said, there's something wrong here. You know, I want to live there, but am I adding to this problem, and so forth. So now the 1990s come along, and we're trying to break out of this quandary. So they said, the problem is sprawl. We've created sprawl. We have stretched the city limits 20, 30 miles. People are in their cars, they're polluting the air with the cars, the highways are filled with commuters. It's not quality of life anymore. It takes somebody 2 hours a day to get back and forth to work. There's no time for the family and a whole bunch of things. And so people came along and they said, but the answer is new urbanism. I don't know if you're familiar with new urbanism. And that's gonna solve all the problems. Smart growth became the battle cry for everyone. But eventually the residential project was hijacked by no-growthers and NIMBYs. I don't know if you know what NIMBYs stand for. It's not in my backyard. In other words, you can do it any way you want, but don't do it next to me. So that's when the development industry and the home building industry all of a sudden became a big pain in the ass. Excuse my language. Up to then, builders had to contend with getting through building departments and planning departments. Now builders and developers were up against legions of armies of people trying to prevent them from making money, from developing. And of course, during that time, and I lived through that, the developer became an ugly person. He was a person that ruined the economy, the environment, made too much profit, and wasn't really satisfying social needs. And so we had this problem, particularly in the 90s. And they said, segregated zoning was now in the crosshairs. That's the problem. So projects came along like Seaside Celebration by Disney, Meisner Park right up here in Boca, Stapleton in Denver. People believe, this could be a solution because we're going to allow a grocery store next to a house. We're going to allow a 6-story condo building next to a single-family house. We're going to allow all that stuff, and we're going to get away from all this cookie-cutter silo kind of planning and so forth. And then big projects came along, Summerlin in Las Vegas, Weston out here, Anthem identified as epicenter of everything that was wrong with America. And here's where I said it was carried out differently, as long as it was somewhere else. But also what was taking place, and this is where I want to start connecting you people to where the industry is today. America started a very evident major shift in demographics, which really started festering itself and becoming obvious in the 90s and into the 2000s. And what's happening to America? Well, the face of America has permanently changed. Historically, going back to colonial days, up until World War II and after World War II, America was predominantly, its roots came from Europe. So most of the people who walked around America and were born here and so forth, their heritage were lines to Germany, England, Ireland, Italy, Spain, I mean all over Europe, predominantly fed America with its population growth. That started changing in the late 20th century in a big way, and has changed today even more graphically. And in my opinion, the century of the European influence on America is over. Never going to be that way again. And now we're heavily influenced by influx of people from Asia, from Eastern Asia, and from South America, Latin America, and there's even a new stream coming from Africa. So what's happening is the face of America is changing. I say this hopefully in a positive way, that I'd like somebody to tell me what the average American is going to look like in 2050, because particularly in South Florida, we are really a microcosm of what the rest of the world and the rest of the United States is going to turn into. We have friends visiting us from California. My partner in California came here for New Year's and stayed with my wife and I. And he's a pretty sophisticated guy. He's developed all over the United States. And we were out to dinner a couple of times, and his wife, Pan, who was a diehard Californian, said, "I can't believe South Florida. We don't have places in Southern California. If you go in a restaurant and you hear people talking and speaking 6 different languages." She said, "That would never go on in Southern California." She says, "That language is over there and that language is over there." But it all seems to mix so easy here. Well, we just take this for granted. Why am I talking about that? Because we're going to get that subject to housing. Because it all comes back like a boomerang, because all these people have to live somewhere and have to live somehow. So the permanent change to the demographic profile of the average household is now underway. And so what people are looking for and waking up to, the American dream was still alive despite all the efforts to dislodge it, but it was taking on many new forms and was becoming unaffordable to millions of Americans. So the start of the 2000s and since, sustainability and green development are the rallying cries. We've got to save the environment. We got to, and we don't care how you build and where you build. In fact, governments now, if you go into the average planning department in the United States, 20 years ago, if you walked in with a blank piece of land, they would have a lot of rules for you to follow. Today, if you go into the city of Fort Lauderdale, or you go into Pembroke Pines, or if you're anywhere, the first thing the planning director says, how many jobs are you going to give us in your land? Not how many houses are you going to build. Why? Because now they think strictly economically. Jobs mean people, people mean houses, people mean buildings. All those things mean real estate taxes. So this is where planning departments are thinking these days. So if you're a young builder or you're a builder and you want to build housing, one of the things you got to keep in mind is they want a positive economic forecast from you of what your housing development is going to do for their income stream. let's see, where am I? And also what happens here is that mixed use and high density are becoming explicit, everybody wants it. The limitations of new urbanism are now known, and the term smart growth is seldom used. It's just assumed that you're gonna do everything smart. We don't need anybody banging you on the head to say, you gotta do smart growth. Your generation, generations to come, you will do smart things. And by the way, it isn't that people like me who built in the 70s and the 80s and 90s did anything that wasn't smart. We were reacting to the market. We were reacting to this waterfall of human beings that needed places to work, that needed places to live. And because remember, a house, a home, whether it's an apartment or a single-family house, it's not like an office building. It's not like a shopping center, which is a financial, economic structure with walls, and you can put spreadsheets to it. You can do what you heard this morning. You can do all this financial analysis of, and so forth, cap rates, NOIs, and that. You can't do that with a house. A house is emotional. It's more than a financial transaction. How many own a home here? 2 people own a home. Very symbolic of your generation today. We're going to talk a little bit about that. When you buy a house, it's probably the biggest financial decision of your life at that time. You may do it 2 or 3 or 4 times, but each time you do it, it takes a lot out of you because it's a scary thing. And so, and then what kind of a house do you want? You know, everybody has their own likes and dislikes, and they want to use the space differently and everything. So a house or residential structure, to me, differs radically from all other real estate structures, which are more defined, which are more copycatted, which are more everything, and are ruled by spreadsheets and IRRs and a whole bunch of things. I don't know a builder in the world who sits down and says, I got to do an IRR on my housing. You know? Now the banks may ask him to do an IRR on his housing project, but the house itself is an emotional, personal, human thing. Because remember, we living in the semi-tropics here, we don't think of a house too much as a shelter. But if you lived in New York or Boston this year, a house was survival. It was a place that if you didn't have it, you were going to freeze to death. You were going to die. So a house performs, you know, life-saving features for we human beings. So it has a lot more complexity that way. And by the way, has way more moving parts than any other thing man builds. The average single-family house in America has over 60,000 pieces. I mean, that's another subject. So, what do we learn so far and up to what I've said so far? And are there anything, you know, we can avoid in the future? And we'll talk about the future. Well, the population explosion in the last 65 years made sprawl unavoidable. So let's get off this once and for all and say, you guys, America, you really destroyed the earth with all your sprawl. Well, the whole truth of the matter is, where the hell were we going to put 165 million people? I mean, it was like, oh yeah, well you should have stayed in the cities. Where? I mean, we're doubling the population of the country in 65 years. We had to go somewhere. Despite, I mean, you might find this interesting. Despite sprawl, do you know that all of America lives on less than 5% of all the land of America? Seems incredible, right? You say, wait a minute. You know, you mean we only take up 5% of America? Yeah, you do. There is a statistic done by a number of organizations that any cluster of people, of 2,000 people or more, now if somebody lives out on a 100-acre farm, they're not included, there are not many there. So if any cluster of 2,000 people or more, put them into the pot, and you will find out that from a land surface point of view, it's only 5% of America. Now if you ever took an airplane flight to California, or out west, and you happen to sit by a window, and you looked out, and America stretches forever, and you never see a house, you don't see a building. Well, that's the United States. And by the way, all of the land west of the Mississippi River, I'm full of little trivia for you. All of the land west of the Mississippi, from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, we own 60% of it. 60% of all the land west of the Mississippi is owned by the federal government. Our land. Problem is, there's a whole bunch of people who keep passing laws forbidding us to go on our land. So, and touching our land, but that's another subject. From the start of 2015, this is for you guys, this is really, this should excite you. I mean, because Jesse was really right on this morning. He gave you the cold, hard facts of the spikes and the charts and everything, and it's kind of scary. You say, wow, you know, we're about to implode again and everything, and we may. But let me tell you something. I've lived through 4 crashes, and I've watched my projects get destroyed. I've watched my own personal wealth go up and down and everything. The real estate is resilient, and it'll always will be resilient. Okay, so here's some good news for you guys. From starting this year, we will add 30 million people in America by 2025. 30 million people are going to need buildings and housing, and another 100 million by 2050. Nothing's going to stop that. We add to the United States every year. We even did it during the recession. 2.8 to 3 million people a year to the United States, year in, year out. Demographers say it's going to go on for at least 30, 40 more years. California, Texas, and Florida, the 3 of them combined, will add about 10 million people and 30 million by 2050. That's not going to stop. Why? Either environmental reasons, the climates, or the economic opportunities. Those 3 places continue to be the drumbeat of American economics. I'm not telling you can't make money in the other states. That's not the point. I'm just trying to tell you that if you're sitting there wondering, when I get my master's degree in real estate development, what should I do with it? You know, well, one of the things you may want to think about, where do I want to live? And where do I want to work? And what environment do I want to be in? Your opportunities will be more favorable in those states, and then again, competition would be also. Okay, population increases and housing replacements. We lose 0.5% of all the housing in America every year gets torn down. It's considered unlivable, dangerous, or too old. So it doesn't seem like much, but 0.5% of 120 million households, which we have 120 million households in America right now. So 0.5% of that gets torn down. Do the math, it's a lot of houses. Okay, so population increases and housing replacements of new housing. We're going to need about 15 million new units, housing units, by 2025. 15 million. And we're going to need 50 million by 2050. That's equivalent to 40% of all the housing stock in America today. Whatever number of housing units we have in this country, by 2050, we're going to add 40% of that number to it. Almost a half. For every house standing today, we're going to build another half house. A lot of production, a lot of housing. Starting in 2010, we talked about these people before, 70 million people turned 65 or older during a 30-year period. Those were the baby boomers. So why do I point that out? Well, I point that out just as a side subject. When we start talking about what kind of housing are we going to need, if you wanted to be in this business, if you wanted to build housing, if you wanted to develop land for housing, one of the demographic profiles that's going to need a lot of attention is this continuing growing number of baby boomers who statistically are living longer and longer. And through medicine and lifestyle changes and everything, not that everybody has great quality of life getting older, but the point is more and more older people are going to be alive, which means they've got to live somewhere, whether it's a single family house, whether it's an apartment, whether it's an assisted living facility, whether it's a nursing home, whatever it is, they got to live in a building that you guys are going to build. Somebody's going to build those buildings. Okay, here's another little trivia thing. More than 50 million new vehicles will be added to the highways and roads over the next 20 years. If you think we have traffic now, over 100 million vehicles will be added by 2050. That's assuming that we continue to have the inability to build public transportation, and assuming that, I don't care whether the cars run on gas, fumes, electric, whatever, people are going to need transportation because no one has the vision right now. It's like asking before this morning, when do you think interest rates are going to change? Well, guess what? Everybody knows these things are coming, but nobody has the vision to say how we're going to handle all this. That's going to be your challenge. Is there a Bill Levitt in the room here? I'm not being funny, because it's going to take, in my opinion, a major tipping point that we can't recognize right now to get all of society to another level. Right now we're struggling, and we'll talk a little bit of that. So, the same quantity and availability of infrastructure resources of the past 50 years cannot be relied upon in the future. What does that mean? We don't have the money to build more highways. We don't have the money to build more bridges. We don't even have the money to fix the bridges that are broken now. So it's one thing to say we're going to put 50 million more cars or trucks on the road in the next 20 years. What are they going to ride on? You know, I'm deviating a little bit from residential, but what I'm talking about is that it all comes together. All these pieces are connected by, these dots are all connected. The point is, we've got serious problems in this country. We will address them in some way or another. We always do when things reach panic stage. That's the American way. And it probably won't get done right, but something will get done. But right now, I can tell you right now, and I'm not the smartest guy in the world, I've been at this for 40 years. I mean, so I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. I don't know anyone that has impressed me with saying, that person really sees the future. No, I don't know anybody like that. I mean, there was a great book written a couple of years ago called The Outliers. I don't know if you read The Outliers. It was a fabulous book. If you haven't read it, you should. It's about people who are on the outside of the normal barriers of life and what makes them so special. What characteristics do they have? Very interesting book. So somewhere in our outliers, I think of people that by some way are going to come and have an impact on some of these problems and these issues. I'm very optimistic about that. Despite urban renewal and higher densities, over 75% of new development for the next 35 years will take place in the greenfields. We're going to still do it that way. We're going to still sprawl because we have no choice. We can only squeeze so many people into downtown Fort Lauderdale. I mean, we're trying like hell. I don't know if you've been downtown Miami recently. It's like riding through the canyons of New York. And they just announced a building the other day, 80-story residential housing tower. Half rent, half condo, 80 stories. You know, and you know, I mean, some of you previous students here, and I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of your present predecessors in this program, live downtown Miami. And all they complain about is the traffic. If you want to get from Brickell up to maybe AAA arena. It takes you a half hour at night. And maybe that's about 2-3 months. So what are they going to do when they keep adding these towers? I don't know. But I know one thing. The one thing is that we're going to have to do a lot of work out where we're not, like we have a lot of land in North Palm Beach County, on the west side of the county. Plenty of land. We can put tens of thousands of houses out there. South Dade County, we can fit tens of thousands of houses, a lot of land. Broward County's finished. Finished. You can't find 20 acres of contiguous land in Broward County. It's totally developed. Whatever is not developed is being built up by a builder. There's a bunch of projects up in northwest Broward by Parkland and north of Coral Spring. That's it. So how is Broward County going to grow? Broward County's got 1,800,000 people right now that we know about. Who knows how many people live here? But what the real number is, who knows? But we know we have at least 1.8 million. Probably at any one time there's over 2 million people here. Is it going to stop growing? Of course not. Of course not. We're going to go up. We're going to tear down 1 and replace it with 4. We're going to tear down 10 and replace it with 50. That's how cities grow. I mean, if you have ever read about like old New York City, I don't know if you're familiar with New York City, at the turn of the century of the 1900s, where Central Park is today, was all farmland. It was all farmland. I mean, from like 50th Street North was just farms. Well, look at it today. I mean, I saw I was in California, I was in his lawyer's office, and he was a historical buck, and he had a wall in one of his conference rooms of aerial pictures of the city of Santa Monica. Like the first one was taken like in 1920, and it was all like little mini farms and some housing. I mean, then there was another one about 30 years, 20 years later, and now it's all kind of filling in. And then there was one recently, which is all nothing is under 4 stories. You know, everything is high density, and that's what's going to happen here. So if you want to be in the development business in Broward County, I suggest you think in terms only of redevelopment. The opportunities will be limitless. We're going to continue to tear things down and replace them and build. And Broward County will grow to 2.5 million people like it's projected to do over the next 20 years. Let's see. Technical advances will alter the American way of living beyond anyone's present vision. That's what he's talking about, the vision. The planned community of the past, how they were designed and marketed, will become insignificant. The nanotechnical wireless world has arrived. And what does that mean? Well, it means that technology is going to play a big role in this, both from a product point of view, from a earning a living point of view, from a quality of life point of view, going to be driven by advancing technology. The successful visionary developers that we talked about, Levitt, Rouse, Fraser, and all, they not only possessed enormous imagination, they also were courageous, they were proactive, they were persistent, social-minded, and thought outside the box. I mean, think about a guy like Bill Levitt. He was just a small little home builder, and he sat down one day and says, where are all these people going to live? He says, well, instead of building 1 house, why don't we build 100? Why don't we build 1,000? By the way, you know what the price of a Levitt home was in 1949? You got a 1/4 acre lot, 3 bedrooms, 1 bath with a carport for $59.90. $59.90. And the government gave you a zero mortgage, 0 interest mortgage. And those houses today, if you go to Levittown today, most houses are double their original size or more. Over half of them are 2-story houses now. But people had a 1/4 acre to work with. And the average home in Levittown is over $750,000 today. I threw this in, I don't know if you know who Bugsy Siegel is. Bugsy Siegel was the mafia crook back in the end of World War II, who went to Las Vegas, and said, oh my God, this is the place to have gambling. This is where we can do all our illegal gambling. So this was the days of the Al Capone, it was after Al Capone, but it was Meyer Lansky and all these characters, because Las Vegas during World War II was a military camp, and Nevada allowed gambling then. So Bugsy Siegel came along and said, you know, we can keep the GIs here, we'll build hotels and we'll have gambling, and of course we, the mob, will steal money out of the casinos, and we'll all make happen. And he literally built the first serious hotel with a casino in Las Vegas. And so my question is, he may not have been social-minded, but would there be today's Las Vegas without him? Would anybody else have thought of that? Who knows? But he was a tipping point, as bad as he was. So the developers of new master plan communities will have to be even more than that. Most successful planned communities of the past advanced beyond their predecessors. It was and is ever improving, and that's the point I made before. Each generation, each decade, the communities got more sophisticated, got better planned, the houses got better planned, they got better built, better materials, stronger houses, longer lasting. It's like our cars. When I was your age or younger, and I had my first beat up old 10-year-old car back then, you imagine what it looked like, we would constantly get flat tires. They didn't have tires like they have today. So it was very common to see people on the side of the road changing tires. Or you had to change the oil like every 200, 300 miles because the oil was so inferior that if you didn't change it regularly, the engine would go bad. I mean, we just take that all for granted now. Well, the same thing about housing. Our housing today, we take for granted that most of these things are going to work and work for a long time. The big question is, who will be tomorrow's residential housing visionaries and innovators? No master plan community design or philosophy proved to be a magic bullet for satisfying marketplace demand and total financial success on a sustaining basis. Ongoing changes and advanced ideas are required to keep pace with the changing marketplace. At one point in my life, I was president of a company that built master plan communities. Master plan communities, big ones like Weston, like all the big plan communities in Broward County, out in Pembroke Pines, in Boca Point, all of the plan communities of Boca and Palm Beach County and so forth. Miami Lakes, a plan community. I was a president of a company that did that all over North America. At one time, we had 15 master plan communities being developed at the same time. And so it was a huge operation. We had contracts with 70 builders building houses in our communities. And so I was very, very active and still am in the ULI. And I remember one day I was on a panel and there were other big developers and there were about 300 or 400 people in the audience. And somebody stood up and said, went to the microphone and said, Mr. Trella, have master plan communities ever made a profit? And there was like silence in the room. Because most master plan communities take anywhere from 10 to 25 years to be developed. And I said, I gotta be honest with you. I don't think so. I don't think anybody that I know of has a record or proof that when 5,000 acres started as farmland way back 20 years ago, and it went through 3 or 4 recessions, booms and everything, and came all the way over here and said, look at that, 20 years and we got this big profit at the end. I don't know anybody in our business can do that. As incredible as that sounds. Now, we didn't have computers, a lot of, I mean, I told somebody before, I would have died for a spreadsheet when I was president. I mean, we were so unsophisticated even in the 80s. We didn't even do IRRs. I mean, When I became a consultant, and all of a sudden I'm doing work for Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and everything, and I'm sitting with all these young MBAs and everything, and they're cranking away and everything. Well, what's the IRR? What's the look back IRR? What's this? I said, oh my God, I got to go home and get my textbooks out. I don't remember any of this stuff. And I was an accounting major in undergraduate school. So, so anyway, but the point is that planned communities and big projects go in cycles. Not only are the building phases in cycles, but so is management, and so are employees. And if you're lucky, in your life, you'll ride a couple of winners. And if you're not lucky, you'll ride some losers. And it doesn't mean you're not good at what you do. It doesn't mean anything. Except that the people who are in charge or running it when it's bad get blamed. And the people who come in when it's booming, they're looked at as heroes, like legends of the industry. But it's not about, you've heard the term in real estate, location, location, location. That's what it's all about? No, it's not about that. It's about timing, timing, timing. You can have the worst piece of land in the worst location and be in the middle of a boom and you'll make a fortune. You can have the best piece of land in a depression and you'll go broke. It's not location. It's the timing of the whole event. It's the coming together of balanced supply and demand at a specific time that has a beginning and an end. We happen to be in a real estate recession to this day. And don't read the newspapers, particularly USA Today and a couple of other newspapers. Their data is so misguided. And you read about, well, housing starts last month with this and this, and Wall Street goes crazy for 2 days and everything. That data is anywhere from 3 to 6 months old. No one is in the trenches really measuring the real estate industry. The only people who are, they are not sharing it with anybody. Goldman Sachs knows, JP Morgan knows, the banks know, the smart intellectual people in the universities know, but they don't share with anybody. They let the government flounder and wander with a lot of bad models, a lot of bad data. So right now, we're still in a real estate recession, particularly in residential. And I'm going to share that, what time is it? Oh, I have a little time. I'm going to share where the industry is today, but I'm almost done with this. So, I told you this before, don't look to the past, and the process cannot be managed through a rearview mirror. All previous plan communities and leaders at the same time are recognized outside of the industry on a local and national scale of positive impact on society. In other words, regardless of what Weston went through, Weston was in court with the government for 10 years, fighting over wetlands. This is what happened when I told you when government all of a sudden in the 80s, all of a sudden, we're going to tell you what to build and what not to build and what you can. Well, Arvida, for those of you who know that company doesn't exist anymore, they were the biggest developers in South Florida. They drew a line in the sand and said, we're not going to let the government push us around. And they fought for almost 10 years, and finally they made peace, and the government allowed them to develop 10,000 acres, and they put 3,000 acres, and it remains in wetlands. So Arvida gave up 3,000 acres of land to develop 10,000 acres of land. But it took a painful fight and money and so forth. Today, Weston is a successful place. It's finished. It's all built out. All the home values are great. There's tens of thousands of jobs there and so forth. So, wow, if you would have just dropped down and you were on Mars and you came in and you said, wow, this was a great social uplift. This really was good for Western Broward County. This was good for all the people who live here. But if you were here in the beginning or while it was being built, you can't believe how many people were cursing Arvida and saying, these ugly developers, look what they're doing to our land and this and that. So eventually, if you can live through all of this, you come out on the positive social side. But I just prepare you. You're going to be in some fights in your life, and it's not just residential. It's office buildings. It's everything. I mean, I know some people down in downtown Miami who bought a piece of land and wanted to build. They're going to build another tower. And if you ever notice downtown Miami, the airplanes going into MIA come over the city, and then they go land out in West Miami-Dade County. Well, the FAA has a corridor that if you build inside that corridor, you're limited to 24 stories. The FAA all of a sudden, and the people I know, bought land right outside that corridor and have like a 60-story building plan. The FAA just came along on their own and moved the line. Now the people have already bought the land, spent all the money on the design, got millions and millions invested, and they said, you can't build that building, we just moved the line for the safety of Miami International Airport. You mean it wasn't safe for the last 40 years? You know, so they're going to be in court. That'll take years. That's the world we live in. So, let's see. All renowned planning were developed by organizations that spawn many of the next generation of successful developers. And I mentioned that about Levitt Company and all its executives that. So that's my overall presentation on that. And so what do we get out of all of that? Let me take a slip of it. Okay, here are the highlights of the industry, in my opinion, today. The American dream, as I described it, I think is still alive and still something that's coveted and something that people still want. We find that immigrants arriving here want the American dream more passionately than Americans who have been here several generations. Because they have a vision of America that's 20 and 30 years old. Because they're not familiar with all of the inner workings and moving parts of what America is today. But they come here, the average immigrant, white, black, don't care, whether they come from Haiti or they come from Brazil, or wherever they come from. They're hardworking, almost in every case, and they save money. They buy a house, they buy a car, they do it. They embrace America. Your generation, don't take this personal, you've been sort of told that you're entitled to all this. It's the generation of entitlements. And I only throw that out there because it's a factor that whether you accept it or not, you have to recognize it's going to inject itself in your business plans and your own dreams. It's because when we design new housing, we have to take into account what are the expectations of the people that are going to live in these things. And it doesn't make any difference what the builder or developer thinks is the right thing to build. It's still marketing. It's still the wants and the needs of the people that are going to buy it and take the financial risk and are going to use the space and so forth. That's who you got to pay attention to. I mean, you heard that this morning from the capital markets side, that the smart marketing capital guys, and boy, have they learned their lesson. They know more about marketing than the average builder does today. When I sit down with capital market guys, and some of my consulting is restructuring business plans, and that time gets into moving things on balance sheets. It's like, well, and we want to, well, there's a rollover debt that you talked about this morning. Well, if another lender's coming in to look at taking that debt and renewing that debt, they're going to drill down into that developer like you can't believe how smart they are and how well they know their market and how well they know their customer. It is stronger today than it's been in my 40 years in the business. Almost everyone's asking finally the right questions. Now, they're tempted to throw money at deals because there's so much cash. And the big mistake they're making, I think, are the low cap rates. These are time bombs. Time bombs. Because the value is not there. You can't force up NOIs. They're going to be what they are. You can raise rents just so much, and people say, no more. It's like all the people that are leaving Lincoln Road right now because they can't afford the rents. So the original merchants that built the Lincoln Road that we know are all being pushed out because of higher rents. But what's happening is, my retail friends tell me this, they're replacing the space with the wrong retailers. They're replacing the space with people that can afford the rents. No one's thinking about it. These people are going to be successful with what they sell. Because the greed of the building owner is, I don't care. If I can get those rents and get the NOI up to that, I'm going to sell this thing at a 4 cap and I'm going to make a fortune. And that's the decision of the day. They don't want to know about anything else. And we'd probably do the same thing. You know, I mean, if we wrote a big check, bought a building, we'd probably walk in those same shoes and the same steps. So what happens? All of a sudden, you reach a level where people can't afford things, and the whole thing collapses. That's what will happen with a lot of the low caps. They're buying hotels with high caps, 4.5 caps. Ridiculous. Because the first real estate product that get killed in a recession are hotels. I mean, in 2008, they all fell off the end of the world. They were giving hotel rooms away. I mean, because people just stopped traveling. Or people don't have the discretionary income. So I tell you that as future executives and leaders of our business or entrepreneurs, I know somewhere in here, some of you, one of you, or some of you, maybe hopefully all of you, you're going to be very successful in real estate. Because you know what? You're here. You're making the sacrifice to come here on a Saturday and a Friday night and take on debt and take risks because you want something more than the other guy wants. And you're willing to pay a price for that. Don't give that up. Stay out in front of the crowd, and this degree will give you that tool. I say that passionately. I've been involved in this program now for 5 years, 6 years. I think this is a fabulous program. They didn't have this when I went to graduate school. You got MBAs, which are good. Well, but it's number crunching. Come on.